We appreciate y'all all coming out here to be with us this morning, especially on such great Chamber of Commerce weather days like this. Appreciate you coming. I know these meetings are a long time in the making. I know that y'all have been to some workshops in the past where we've talked about our CFD program. And so what we're here today is to really bring you up to speed on what we've accomplished thus far. City Council has been very interested in trying to address a lot of the citizen concerns that they have had regarding this particular program and the impact that it has on each and every one of our individual taxpayers. So we're happy to present to you an analysis of where we are and some strategies that we have to provide at least a little bit of relief. Unfortunately, this program is set up with decisions that were made in the past, and so we're all having to do the best we can around things that we can't change at this point. So as we go through this morning, you'll hear us highlight those issues, and we'll talk to you about those things. If you look at the structure of the meeting, we've got a little agenda that came out to you. We're going to walk through a presentation for you, and then at the tail end, we've got a healthy amount of time to try to field any questions and comments that you want. The cards that you have are really color-coded based on your neighborhood area, and that's important because, as we'll describe to you a little bit later, each one of your IAs, as we call them, your improvement areas, have specific things that we can do within those areas, or specific things that we can apply, and certain different financial factors that affect each and every one of them. This is a very complicated process. My name is Scott Parton, by the way, City Manager since October 31st of this year. It's been my pleasure to work within the community and to work through a variety of very challenging issues. The city has really, over the 6 months that I've been here, I got to be here towards the tail end of a lot of work that's happened over the last 2 years. And I think y'all are pretty well familiar with what had happened a couple years ago with the raids and arrests and all those kinds of things. So those issues that happened left the city in a bit of a challenging position. And so the very first order of business was to try to create financial stability, to make sure that our city could continue to function, to make sure that our city could meet the primary city obligations and operational needs that it has. We've made some significant progress to that end over the last few months. The W. Cox settlement was huge. We had a judgment against the city of about $47 million, I can't remember the exact number. With interest and some other things, we had a judgment that was about $66 million. So we were able to work through that and get that resolved. And it left the city in a position to be financially stable. We're working through some other resulting key issues that are there. We really can't disclose those too much at this point. They are works in progress. But at the end of the day, we have achieved that basic stability. The good thing about where we are and what's happened is we also now have reached a point where we're starting to make significant progress towards major capital needs. We're looking at some interchange improvements, some signalization at Oak Valley and I-10. We're looking at improvements on Pennsylvania Avenue and I-10 to help alleviate the traffic that's on Highland Springs. We're looking at improvements on Highland Springs itself. So there's additional long-term improvements on Oak Valley Drive from Highland Springs all the way past where it begins to hook up towards Fairway Canyon. So there's a lot of capital things that we're now turning our attention to and we'll be accomplishing over the next 3 to 5 years. When you look at our sewer plant, we're in the process of addressing our sewer plant to take the next step to address interim growth, and then we've got some long-term plans to develop that. But the work is just starting. We just hit stable. The work is now just starting. These CFDs represent the first step in trying to come out and proactively work with our community, work with our citizens to begin to get input. One of the things we need to do is to look at what the additional things our community needs, what additional things our community wants. And those things are really defined by our citizens. So there needs to be an ongoing community outreach moving forward. You picked up some flyers this morning on the general plan update. That's one example, of a major project we're working on right now. There's a link to a website on that flyer that shows you where to go and begin to sign in and take a citizen survey. And there's workshops that will be advertised and things that will be published and utility bills and things like that as reminders to town. But those types of things are important. As we look at our long-term capital needs, parks, other road improvements, major city facilities, things like that, there's other citizen involvement processes that we'll implement to begin to identify and address those. But they all boil down to the dollars we have at hand and the priorities that we need to make moving forward. But council is committed to trying to do things differently than what happened in the past. They want to be involving our citizens. They want to be as transparent as they can in looking at how we're budgeting, looking at how we're tracking our funds, how we're tracking our CFD dollars, or new processes being put into place. Phase one of those are being implemented now, and they'll evolve and grow as we get into the next 6 to 12 months. Again, I can't highlight enough that we're really in the process of trying to make the best of a bad situation. And there's just things that unfortunately we just have on our plates that we've got to work through. We have a team of folks here at the table. One of the best things I think that our council and our staff did before I got here was to bring in a good qualified team to help us work through these particular situations. So I'd like to introduce the people at the table. So Albert Webb and Associates is the city's special tax consultant. And they're the ones that help us administer our CFD program. They're helping us to prepare our budgets and our financial tracking, as well as calculating your special tax assessments as they apply to you. So we have Heidi Shope, she's the Director of Municipal Finance. We have Richard Wall, our Finance Manager with the Urban Futures, Inc. is a municipal consulting firm, and they are also help the city as a financial advisor. They've also helped the city do some financial modeling to help us begin to recover from what we're going through. And Michael Bush is here with us. He's the CEO. And let me tell you, Michael came in to Beaumont when the house was on fire. And I can tell you, not a lot of consultants, not a lot of people would come in when things are at their worst. And so he was there and he was instrumental in helping us to reach out to that. So Piper Jeffrey and Company is a public finance consulting firm. They help cities and public agencies as one branch of their business to structure and evaluate debt. And so they've been instrumental in helping us again to evaluate the debt that we do have through our CFD program. And they're helping us figure out how we can best refinance or restructure that debt. So let me give you a little word. When we say refinance, what we're talking about is really, or refunding is the same thing in our layman's terms. So when we say refinance, where you may say refunding in part of that document, that doesn't mean we're necessarily getting dollars back. It means that we literally are refunding part of the bonds that may be out there. Who have I missed? So Katie, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Katie Koster with Piper. And then finally, we do have bond counsel. We have some special legal services that we need. Brian Forbath is our bond counsel. He's with Stradlin, Yoka, Carlson, and Rolf. We do have one city council member here. Julio Martinez is here with us this morning. Good morning, Julio. One of the key issues, and we don't have a majority of council here really on purpose, and that's because our council live in some of these areas that we're looking to potentially restructure. And so we don't want to have any potential or apparent conflicts of interest. So our council's been very careful about trying to let this process work through, hear what our consultants are telling us, and then hear what kind of feedback that we're getting from our citizens. So we are planning on the 16th of this month to make a full report back to council. This is the second of 4 of these community meetings that we're doing. We're trying to go to basically 4 different major areas of the city to try to talk to as many people as we can. So there'll be a full report back to council with the results of all these meetings that we're doing. overall, again, our meeting this morning is to review the current Melrose program. Now, Melrose is the name of the act. It actually created community facilities districts. So you'll see us say CFD as the acronym. It's the same thing. So we talk about Melrose taxes, but it really is CFD and CFD funding. So please know when we say CFD, we do mean Melrose. So it's not a difference. It's not a word game. We're trying to be consistent. That's there. So we'll walk through that. We'll present the options that we have for restructurings and the level of relief that we may be able to provide as savings. There is some additional feedback. There are some discretionary parts of the funds that are there also. And they are called either pay-go or they're called future facilities. So those are, and what Rich will walk you through is how your tax bill is set and how those funds come in and how those funds have to be applied. But there's 2 or 3 basic things that have to be done with those tax dollars. One is to pay the bonds, that's the debt. 2 is to set aside a reserve, so in the event that there's slow pays or no pays, that there's a reserve there to continue to make those debt service payments. The 3rd is administrative costs. It costs dollars to do annual reporting, programming, to set tax rates, to do all that work. There's a lot of work that goes into administering the program. And then the final piece is pay-go. There's an additional amount that comes in above the things to cover those 3 things. And that's where there's some discretion towards specific types of improvements. So, some of the feedback we need is along those lines. Now, once we get done with our final Citizen Town Hall community meeting, we will go online through SurveyMonkey with a survey instrument that looks at specifically those discretionary dollars that it talks about. So there's about 5 questions that will be on that survey. So we're looking for additional information. So it's a lot to take in today. I know there's going to be a lot of questions you're going to have. And there's some things that you're going to think about as you leave this meeting today. I'm sure I would have a ton of questions myself. So that's there. There'll be some additional follow-up. But again, I would strongly encourage you to either, if you can, to attend on the 16th or at least come in. Julio doesn't know this yet, but I talked to the mayor. We're talking about on the 16th doing a 5 o'clock or 5 p.m. special meeting where we will talk the CFD. We'll also then link that to the budget so you can see how the CFD and the budget is working and how it comes together. And when you came in this morning or after you came in, you received a little packet, a little agenda packet, and there's some.
Awesome.
There's a few pages I'd like to just introduce you to real quick. The second page, you see this table. So this table shows you all the improvement areas that are subject or eligible for restructuring to some degree right now. And so I show you that because to show you that there's a lot there, but we're really only addressing maybe half of all the areas right now. The other half of our IAs are not ready yet for any kind of treatment. So if you look on the back of that page, you'll see a map. So those improvement areas correspond to the numbers on this map. And the color coding really kind of gives you an idea as to the type of relief that each area may be eligible for. And so you can also coincidentally see the card that you grabbed, or when you look at where your neighborhood may be, you'll see if that corresponds back over here. One of the things that we'll talk about a little bit later is how the special tax through your CFD or your Melrose program works. But one important thing to note is this page right here. This gives you an idea about your tax, how it's collected for your basic property tax. So if you look at that, this shows you through the school district all the way down through the other special taxing authorities what's there. And what I'd like to draw your attention to, so this would be a typical dollar. If you added all those numbers up, it comes to 0.9997 cents. So that's basically $1. But the city, to your general fund, out of that dollar, about 8.4 cents comes to the city out of your total base property tax bill. And so one of the things I'd like to draw your attention to is, you see where it says ERAF, ERAF. That was part of your local tax dollars that is taken by the state of California that goes towards financing education. So out of your total tax, about 25 cents of it goes to the state for education, about 8.4 cents of it goes to the city. One important thing to note too is that a lot of the areas in the city that have developed and have occurred over time have been as a result of annexation into the city, and then development has occurred after that. In those areas, the county still retains 75% of your property tax. So that tax that's collected off those properties, the county still retains 75% of that. So only 25% comes into the city. And so when we talk about services and capital needs, there's alternative things that have to come forward to begin to cover those types of things that are out there. But I think it's just important to know. And now, and these follow your standard tax setting property processes where we have an assessed value that's set. And by the way, these rates are set by the state, not locally. And so those are set, those are applied then to your assessed value, and then your tax bill is generated. The assessments that work on the CFD side, either through sources or facilities, are different. They're not really structured that same way. And so, again, we'll highlight and we'll kind of work through in that process a little bit later. So the balance of the information is information that for you to walk through as Katie presents specific information to you. So there's 4 specific IAs where we are looking at some opportunities to refinance or to refund those bonds. And so this kind of represents that. So the first page shows you all the indebtedness that's out there through the CFD program. And then there's some extractions for each one of the other areas that is available. Again, if y'all are ready, I'm sure you're tired of hearing me talk. You want to get to the experts and hear the good information. So with that, I'd like to turn it to Rich with Webb & Associates to begin.
Thank you, Todd. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for sacrificing part of your Saturday morning to come out and join us. My name is Rich Wall with Aubrey Webb Associates.
Come closer. Look closer. Gotta get
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, so, my name is Rich Wall with Aubrey Webb Associates. We're the city's special tax consultant, as the city manager mentioned. A little bit about Webb. We've been providing special tax and assessment consulting services for over 40 years. We have a large client base in Southern California and Riverside County, with several clients that have a very large CFD network, similar or larger in scope to the city of Beaumont. And so we're well versed in the requirements to maintain a network of CFDs. We'll be covering quite a bit of information that is going to range from just basic CFD principles and statistics, as well as specific questions we've gotten from the community we want to address up front. And then my colleagues and I will kind of trade off through the presentation, covering different points here. And so what I'm going to do is just kind of start us off on the use of CFDs in California, just do a little brief overview for everyone, so for your own knowledge. And so starting with the first slide here, California statistics. This is really just to show everyone that CFD use in the state it's widespread. It's not anything that's unique to the city of Beaumont. And when we look at the numbers, just looking statewide, there are nearly 900 agencies that have CFDs. Approximately 1,400 of them have issued bonds to the tune of about $16 billion outstanding. Riverside County, specifically, there's 40 agencies with just over 300 CFDs with about $3 billion. So it's not a trend, unique to the city, but just to illustrate the use statewide. And then when we talk about the city of Beaumont, your city has a very vast network of CFD programs. CFD 93-1. That has multiple improvement areas, and then each of those improvement areas have a different tax. And so if you added all those up, it's approximately 72 different improvement areas that we'd be talking about. And 29 of those have issued bonds, and that's part of the scope of the project we'll be talking about here this morning. And as of September 2015, there was just over $200 million outstanding. And so just wanted to give you that for some background on the use of CFDs. The next slide here, we're going to talk about some key facts to remember. This is a result of feedback we've gotten from property owners over the last couple of years and then some recent meetings we've had. And so we just want to get out front and provide this for your knowledge so you have a basic understanding of the city's involvement, the bonds and how they've been used, and then your tax bills as you've received them. And so the bonds specifically, we want to point out that this money, the proceeds that were received from these bonds, it has already been spent. It is gone. The city is not holding on to any of it. There have been times over the years you'll see, recently as 2015, some bonds were refinanced, and that's essentially very similar practice as a homeowner. If you refinance your mortgage, you get a lower rate. That was it. There was no money taken out. There was no more proceeds from that specifically. And so when we look at bonds, their repayment is basically secured by the special taxes that are levied upon all of your properties. And so that's kind of the basis for the bonds. As we move through the city's involvement, there are some limitations that the city's not able to assist with from that perspective. So we had some property owners reach out to say, why can't the city help? And in fact, if the city had the means, they're actually legally prohibited from providing general funds or any other source of city revenue to pay any of the CFD debt. And another point we wanted to point out was the lack or misunderstanding of the CFD as it applied to your property. And so a common complaint is I didn't know there was a CFD, or I didn't know that the CFD escalated annually. And so we wanted to be clear that the developer or the person who sold the home, not the city, was responsible for disclosing that to you at the time of purchase. And so really that would be between the property owner and the title company or the seller. So we just wanted to make that distinction, that clarification for everybody here this morning. And then the last one, we're talking about property tax bills. So this is, there's multiple agencies involved in your property tax bill. I know it's common to kind of blame the city you live in when you get a property tax bill, especially with the environment with the CFDs. And so we just want to kind of point out some topics here. First and foremost, the city is legally obligated to enroll the CFD 93-1 special taxes on your property tax bill. They have to do it. The other agencies, such as the county's ad valorem or general purpose tax, I know there's a San Gregorio hospital measure. Those are other entities that they're not the city of Beaumont. They have no control over them. They have no say in the enrollment for those. A large impact that we would see and a common complaint is my property tax bill went up $500 from last year. And so the tendency is to blame the CFD and the city, but when I've sat down with property owners and I've compared their two tax bills in the last 2 years, where that increase is actually the county ad valorem tax. And the reason being is because of the way and the nature of that tax is structured. And I won't go into great detail, but there's two propositions, Proposition 13 and Proposition 8, they're in play there. And so very basically, Prop 13 was initiated to limit the amount of taxes that could be imposed on your property from the county. So it limited to 1% of the assessed value, and then limited that increase to 2% per year. So when you bought your home, you set your base value. In times of recession and inflation, your assessed value changes, your property tax bill will change based on the assessed value. But in the background, that many people don't understand is there's still a ticking amount that is climbing every year, 2% per year, based on the value of your home when you purchased it. So when we go through the recession, property values declined, your tax bill went down. But as the market recovered, the county has the right and the ability to jump back up to whatever that gain is. So if that gain was 10, 15, 20% for the year, Proposition 8 allows them to go right back to where they can, up to the threshold of your Prop 13 limitation. So I know that it may not make a lot of sense, but we just want to share that with you, going back and listening to the property owners' concerns. That's probably in most cases the reason for your property tax bill increase. And as I mentioned before, the other agencies on that bill are not the city of Beaumont, they are the other agencies, and there would be contact information for each one of them there. And on the next slide here, we're going to get into the CFD prepayment program. I know I probably spoke to some of you in this room over the last couple of years about actually prepaying more special taxes, and so the city is still in the process of addressing that and rolling out a prepayment program. What is expected is that around June, that would be formalized and approved through council, and it would be implemented in September of this year. So they implemented it would be tentatively for this year, but to address why there would be a delay from June to September is in any city, even one that had been accepting prepayments even to this day, Through the annual administration, we actually have a blackout period between June and August. And the reason for that is we're actually doing the annual enrollment, the calculations for your tax bills. And so when a property owner prepays in a CFD, that affects everybody else. And so it's problematic to have people prepaying during that period and try and come up with what we're going to enroll for everybody. So there's a blackout period, and then come September, that's lifted and prepayment procedures can continue. We don't have a policy that's rolled out at this point, but the understanding and the expectations is essentially there would be a notification, some information posted on the city's website. That information would detail the program, how the procedure and the policy and how that would take place. There is possibly a discussion about there would be an estimated range that many of the property owners here were used to seeing from the past administration. But I want to be clear and stress that it would be an estimated range, that it cannot be used to actually pay off your prepayment. A formal process needs to be completed. So the city's hopes and the council's intent to help the community and show as much transparency and give as much information as possible would be to give you that range to let you know if you knew there was no chance you were going to do it, based on that dollar amount, then that would be the end of it for you. But if it seemed considerable and you wanted, it seemed that you had the means to do it, then you could proceed through the actual formal process. That process would start with an application. There would be a fee associated with it. Unfortunately, I don't have the amount of that fee. It has to be determined by council and the city staff, but it will be clearly defined for all the property owners. And the last part I wanted to talk about is why is this required? Why can't you get a prepayment amount right now? And essentially, a CFD does not record a lien like with a dollar amount like your mortgage would, or a standard assessment district. What the CFD records is a special tax that's levied against your property. And that special tax can vary from year to year based on the special tax formula. So it's for these reasons that an actual payment calculation has to be done each time, because as time progresses, the amount changes. As other properties prepay, the amount changes. And so that's the distinction of why there's a prepayment process that's required. The next slide is a question we've been asked fairly recently, and we wanted to also provide information on, is how was the original tax calculated? Who came up with it? How was it done? And so, unfortunately, we don't have that information. None of us that are in this room here today were the ones that actually came up with it. But what I can explain in general and how it works in a CFD anywhere else is that it's basically structured to pay for financing facilities. And it's a negotiation between the developer and the public agency that would be forming the CFD. That agency's policies would come into play. There's policies that they would set up when they form the CFD that they would adhere to when they actually form in the CFD. And those policies could range from the total effective tax rate that they would have allowed on the property, very common is 2%. That's set based on the estimated sales price of the home at formation. And in many cases here in the city of Beaumont, that was actually the pre-recession prices. It also could take into consideration annual escalation in your special taxes from year to year. The rate's going to depend also on what the developer's proposing to build, what product mix, how many homes, what size of homes. That rate will vary by the size, the location, the lot that it sits on, and as well as the land use classification. So there'd be a different tax for residential property versus non-residential property. All of this is defined in what's known as a rating method of apportionment, or RMA. And you're going to hear several terms throughout this presentation. They're defined in the RMA. They came from this RMA. And the key ones you'll hear is the assigned tax rate and the special tax requirement. And so at the time the district was formed, an RMA was approved, and then when the reported notice of special tax lien was put up on the property, that RMA was included, which defined the tax rates for each of these properties. The next slide is basically a timeline for the annual administration process. It's actually the first half of one. What's not on here is some regulatory reporting. I'll cover that as well. But in general, when you have a CFD, any CFD, these are the steps you're going to take to actually do that annual administration. So when asked what is the annual administrative expense paid for, these are the things that it's paying for. So we would come out in March, April of each year, we meet with the agency, and we go over the budgets that need to be required. We request building permit information, and we do what's known as parcel research. And this can span for a couple of months between April and July. We go through and we're actually calculating the taxes based on the budget that was established, and then we are applying those to all the properties. We would help the agency in drafting the legal documents, staff report, and then go to a meeting at the city council to approve these. So in this meeting, this schedule was tentatively June 20th. For the city of Beaumont, it actually may be later in the month of July. After the resolution is approved, there's some compliance documents that need to be submitted to the county assessor's office. We would then actually physically enroll the properties on the assessor's tax roll approximately August 10th of each year. After that, starting in September, we go into what's called the reporting season. So there's, for bonded CFDs, much like the ones that the city of Beaumont has, there's 2 reports that are required. It's the CD Act report, which is a California Debt Investment Advisory Commission report, required to report some key metrics on the bonded improvement areas and the bonds outstanding. And then there's also what's known as the continuing annual disclosure report, also reports bond information. Those are due February and December of each year. So that would be a full life cycle. So that ends us in February, and then March, April, we're starting all over for the very next year. And you just continue until the CFD has reached its maturity. The next slide is going to be more specific of the rest of this presentation. What I covered is was kind of basic, high-level information, but as we are going into now the meat and potatoes, why we're here, we wanted to point out a couple of things. There are 2 types of taxes that you'll pay on your CFD and CFO. One's of facilities and one's of services. So the facilities is there to, and it's, by the way, the biggest line item on your CFD portion. They will pay for the construction acquisition of public facilities. They issue bonds and they have a maturity date. And the maturity date basically means it expires. At some point in time, it's going to go away, you'll never see it again. The second part is the services, which we're not going to talk about for the purpose of this presentation, but I just want to cover it so you're aware. Services pays for the annual operation and maintenance of public improvements such as landscaping of your streets and medians and parkways, parks, open spaces, street maintenance, street sweeping, traffic signals, street lights, things of that nature. That is not allowed to issue bonds. Services don't issue bonds. They generally last as long as the agency is providing a service, which basically to say that it lasts forever. So we just want to make that distinction. The newer CFDs are actually coming on, actually have a public service component, so they're paying, those property owners are paying for police and fire, paramedic, and ambulance services as well. So the next slide is special tax requirement. So as we mentioned with the RMA, it is defined in the RMA, and this is the actual definition from one of the city of Beaumont's special tax requirements. I will not read it in its entirety, but basically what this is a recipe for your budget. This is telling you what you're collecting the taxes for. And then the next slide is actually going to go into the detail and just kind of simplify that for everybody. When we prepare the special tax requirement, we are preparing the budget for what we're going to enroll on the taxes. That special tax requirement translates into your special tax for your property. As the city manager mentioned, there's a few items that are fixed. There's nothing that the city has discretion on, and then there's an item that there is some discretion on. Those fixed items are the debt service payment. So much like everyone in this room makes a mortgage payment, there's a debt service payment to the bondholders that's required. Instead of doing it monthly, the city has to pay it twice per year. They pay in March, they pay interest. In September, they pay principal and interest. There's an administrative expense. That expense goes through to cover those items that I explained in the timeline from the annual administration process. There's a delinquency reserve that's calculated, and what we do is we actually use the previous year's delinquency rate, so that will fluctuate from year to year, but that's there to cover any properties that aren't paying their taxes on time at all. And then the future facilities. And the future facilities is one that's collected, and you'll hear that term synonymous with PAYGO. That's the discretionary line item that the city can work with, and that's funds that are being collected that are in excess of the actual fixed costs that they have to pay, the obligations that they have to take underway. And so if we reduce that future facilities charge, that would actually reduce the special tax requirement, which would translate into lower taxes to each of the property owners. So the next slide is eligibility for the special tax requirement. There's always a catch, right? So the catch in this case is it has to be done case by case. There's not one size fits all. We have to apply a test, and that test is simple. It's 2 questions. Has the improvement area fully developed, and has it issued all of its bonds? And so if the answer is yes to both of those questions, then the improvement area would be eligible for a special tax reduction. If the answer is no to either of those questions, unfortunately, the assigned tax rate would still need to be maintained on those properties until such time as they were fully developed and issued all their bonds. But all is not lost as you're collecting those funds for improvement area that hasn't issued all its bonds. Those funds are getting set aside in an account that are going to offset the amount you would have to issue at bonding. So when you bond, if you take out less debt, you have a lower payment. So you get credit for that on the back end. And the reason why we continue at the assigned rate, essentially the biggest reason is for consistency of property owners. So those of you who have a mortgage and you have an impound account, What we don't want to do is give your tax here 1 year and then give you a low year tax year this year and then a high one back up the next year. That's going to fluctuate your mortgage payment. You're going to get notified and your impound account's going to go up. And so we see consistency across the board. So the next slide has the results. We applied that test to the improvement areas that are listed on this presentation. Essentially, there are 7 improvement areas that are combined here. Those that are eligible for refunding would equal 4 improvement areas. There's also 4 that have a reduction for the pay-go or the future facilities. Then combined, there's 5 improvement areas, so it would be 3, 14, 14A, 14B, and 18 that we're going to show you some reductions in your special tax that you will see potentially here in the next year. So the last thing to add on here on this table is the fund balance, and so we're going to talk about that next. The fund balance are funds that have been accumulated over the years that we are now estimating to go back to each of your improvement areas. And I'll explain why we're estimating that here on the next slide. And essentially, in the past, there was one account the city held. And as I mentioned, there's 72 improvement areas. Not all of them were having a special tax enrolled, but the ones that were, I believe off the top of my head, was 59. All those funds came back into the city and they went in one account. And then the city paid all the expenses out of that one account. And what the city is going to do now, moving forward, is for a level of transparency, is have an individual account in the city that is tied to the individual improvement area and for that specific tax and purpose. So at any given time, anyone could ask how much money is there, what was being used for, how much was collected. The city could account for it. And then the revenues will come into that account, and there'll also be the expenses being paid from that account. But to get started, we had a pool of money, and we needed to go backwards and work there. So what we did is we took a test and took the balance, and we applied it to several buckets. And so not all of these buckets are going to be applicable to every improvement area, but essentially the different buckets would be the debt service payment that was required, estimated prepayments that have been collected from property owners in the past, future facilities, development impact fees, debt service coverage, reserve, and then the remaining balance is what we saw on that previous slide. That the city has some discretion and wants your input on how those funds should be spent. Next slide here basically gives a little more information, the definition of each of those buckets. Again, I want to reiterate that not every improvement area has all of these included in their total, but essentially the debt service, as I explained, is the amount to pay principal and interest on the bonds. Estimated prepayments are from properties that had prepaid their special taxes in the past. Future facilities we discussed being held in an account at such time the bonds will be issued. Development impact fees, so when a builder builds a home, they have to pay fees for each permit they pull. Those fees translate into different projects that the city uses those funds for. Debt service coverage would affect actually some of the improvement areas in this room where there are multiple improvement areas paying into one bond. So at the end of the day, there's a calculation, there's more that had been collected that was actually needed to pay, so that the city is giving credit back to the property owners for that. The city is holding a reserve to be fiduciary stewards. They don't want to just jump to the end and say, let's spend everything. So there's some funds being held at such time that all of the obligations are determined to be satisfied, and those funds would become eligible. And then the remaining balance, that's the amount we're talking that the city wants your feedback on. That remaining balance is that total at the end that I showed. So at this point, I've kind of reached a point to move over to the refunding process. I'm going to turn it over to Michael Bush. He's going to continue on, and then we'll jump back up and wrap everything up for you. Thank you.
Good morning. We are going to talk a little bit about the bond refinancing. It's going to be a tag team effort between Ms. Coster and myself. As the city manager had mentioned, I was brought into the city when it was still a little bit on fire. The bad guys were gone. There were a lot of gaps in understanding what was happening. As Richard pointed out, there was a lot of reconciliation work that had to be done. Quite candidly, I don't think I've seen a city with worse accounting records than this one when I got here. And I managed the bankruptcy in San Bernardino. And so to put that into perspective, to come a long way, to Todd's point, 2 years has been a lot of work. We have resolved the budget deficit. If you recall, there was an $8 million negative cash balance in the general fund. I think we've dealt with that. Todd mentioned a little bit about the lawsuit. The one thing we've heard consistently is the CFD program is broken. And there was a lot of questions and concerns about the program. The council took that up pretty early on in our assignment and asked us to start working on the CFD, and we broke it up into two distinct functions. As Richard pointed out, they handled more of the day-to-day administration. We went back and looked at how all the money was spent. And so about a year ago, we were asked by the city to do a reconciliation of all bond money. And on the city's website, for those of you who want to look, I think our report is there. It's dated, I think, June of 2016. It's a CFD bond reconciliation report. There were about 34 bond issuances in the city. Most of those were new money issues, meaning dollars, bond proceeds to build facilities. At the bottom of this slide, you'll see the difference between those two. Refinancing bonds was about $110 million, and we were in charge of looking at where that $257 million was spent. There were bonds issued in these improvement areas that are listed here. We're going to talk about some of those in more detail today. So this is a summary of how the money was spent, and if you want to look at the report, there's a lot more detail on the report itself. I think the presentation to council, 75 slides, so there's plenty to look at. There's good examples in there of where the money went. You break it down by actual vendor, so you can see which vendors got paid, you can see which contractors were paid, which developers, and so forth. But this is basically a summary of how the money was spent. One thing you might notice, just to point it out, the total we found was $258 million. As you recall from the prior slide, the issuance was about $257 million. While these dollars are held by the bank, they actually earn interest. And so they spent a little bit more than the bond proceeds because those dollars were earning interest while they were held by the banks. Most of the money, as you can see, was spent on design and engineering. There was some construction paid to third parties. When the CFD bonds were issued, they were also issued for the purpose of paying fees, not only to the city for its development impact fees, but also to other agencies. And so if you look at that report, you'll see the local water agency got paid quite a bit of money. I want to say it was somewhere in the $20 to $30 million range from all of the bonds that were issued. Of this $40 million, they were the lion's share of it. A lot of the money went to contractors to build the roads throughout some of the developments in town. Water lines, sewer lines, expansion of the sewer treatment plant were all included in there. And there was also some reimbursements to the developers. As developers were building the neighborhoods, they were building some of the facilities that they were being reimbursed for. And about $50 million went into the city, and the city implemented projects on its own on the behalf of the CFD, the 93-1 CFD. So I wanted to cover that. I thought that would be important for this group to see that. But again, if you want to see the detailed report, it is available. And if you can't find it, somebody at the city can get a hold of me and I'll send it to you. I'll make sure you get a copy of it. We have some standards that we work with as it relates to CFDs, and one of the things that we've been able to provide the city is what is referred to as a CFD goals and objectives policy. It kind of outlines how the program should be managed on a best practice basis. It's typically the same type of practice and policy that are commonly used by the public agencies. We didn't quite see one here when we got here. And so we wanted to make sure that there was something that the council could point to, or the staff could work from, or even the residents could use to understand how the program works. Part of those policies and goals functions are also a discussion about how to manage the debt itself. And so a common standard when you're looking at savings for refinancing of outstanding debt, CFD or otherwise, is it has to be at least 3%. The reason why it has to be 3% is because there's a lot of costs associated with debt. You have to pay the bank. It's similar to when you mortgage your house. You pay points, you pay the loan origination fee, you pay a bank fee. Similar fees are structured inside of municipal bond debt. So we want to make sure you at least have 3% savings. That's net of paying everybody. So it has to be 3% plus those costs. We also looked at the average savings per household, and in this presentation you'll get some more information on that, as Costa will cover. But we also want to look at some other factors, and so the last several months when we've been working with the staff, we didn't just look at the debt itself in terms of looking at where interest rates were. Candidly, we're probably in a good position. We're at near historical lows of interest rates for tax-exempt municipal bonds. That is really what's affording us to actually come forward today and present this to you. In addition to that, as Richard was pointing out, we also, working with Todd and his staff, suggested that we look at all other funds that the city may be holding to put those into the transaction. So Rich pointed out that there may be some discretionary funds or funds held on hand. Part of that plan is to get some feedback from you so that we can determine whether those monies want to go towards new facilities, assuming there are some facilities that may not be completed, or there's some desire for facilities to be completed that may not have been originally in the plans. If the decision is that there are no needed new facilities, those monies the city holds goes into this pot and it will reduce the debt. So we're going to take the money the city's been holding and buy down a little bit of debt. It's part of the refinancing. That should create additional savings. In addition to that, Mr. Forbath, who's just reminding me of something, when some of these improvement areas were created, they were created with a delinquency reserve. And not all of them have that, but for those that do, we'll also look at those monies too, because typically what we're finding is delinquency rates throughout the city are very low. People, for the most part, pay their taxes. I think we've seen a couple of homes in each improvement area, very minor. I think the last presentation we gave, there were 660 homes, and I think the delinquency was 2 or 3 homes out of 600. And so that's not an issue. So when we start looking at money being held, we're going to look back and look over time and see if there's a need to hold that much money. I'm thinking there probably is not, based on what we've seen. Other goals, we want to make sure we create a level debt service plan. I know that there's escalations in some of these project areas or improvement areas. We'll talk a little bit about those as we go forward in the presentation. Then obviously, if there's anything restricted in the covenants, we want to look at those to make sure they're less restrictive going forward. Next slide, please. So some of the call provisions, when the bonds were issued initially, they all had call provisions included. And call provisions mean, in a nutshell, when the city can refinance them or restructure them. And most of them are with a 10-year call. That's pretty standard. So you'll see the 3 types. 10 years most common. There are some tiered calls with some of the bonds here. By tiered, what I mean is, at a certain point, you can refinance them paying for a slight premium. So let's say it's year 9 of the bond existence. You can refinance them for 1% of a premium. You wait till the 10th year and the premium goes away. And so it's somewhat like an incentive for both the investor and the city to have an opportunity to restructure debt. A lot of the bonds that were here were done with 10-year calls. We've looked at all of those, and we'll get into the detail of that as part of the go-forward presentation. We start looking at each improvement area. There are a couple here that have both call provisions on any date after the call. So let's say, for example, I think Richard pointed out that payments are due in September, principal and interest payment. Typically, that would be a call date too, as they would say, okay, on these premium dates or call dates, you can refund the bonds. Here you have some of those. We also have some you can call anytime after you've reached that 10 years. So we can call it on, January, February, March. We don't have to wait till September. And we'll go through the details of those as well. And I mentioned the city does have a few deals that have premiums. I think there's one that Katie's going to cover as part of this presentation as well. Next slide. Before I turn it over to Katie to get into the details, I'm going to talk very briefly about this slide because I think it's going to fit into the next slide that she will take from this point going forward. The city has done bonds in 2 different fashions. It's done a standalone, meaning an improvement area issued debt all by itself, based on its own credit and the own development. And there's others where they've used multiple improvement areas. They've kind of pooled them together and issued debt for all of them. There is an opportunity to look at them in that regard going forward. I think what Ms. Koster is going to go over in great detail as our plan is to look at every opportunity there is to refinance debt, to reach out to a long list of banks and solicit them for rates, similar to how you would shop your mortgage. We're not going to go to one bank and say, give us our interest rate. We're going to give 15 banks an opportunity to bid on the debt itself. We're going to look at it from a standalone, meaning each improvement area will be looked at individually. We're hopeful, however, that through this process, we'll find 1 or 2 banks that will be interested in refinancing the city's debt. And I may not have covered this earlier, but the amount of debt we're trying to refinance is $100 million. So it's half, roughly, of what's outstanding. So it's a great opportunity going forward for the residents to have a tax reduction. I've been in public finance for over 25 years, and this is maybe the 4th or 5th time I've been able to sit in front of somebody and say we can actually lower taxes. It's usually the other way around. We're trying to get more. In this case, the goal is to lower the tax rate. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Katie, and she'll go over some detail specific to this development.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
No.
No? How about this? Better? Okay, great. All right, so there is a very detailed chart up here for you to take a look at, and I'm going to go through it a little bit methodically. So what we've tried to portray here for you is the list of each and every improvement area that has bond debt associated with it, as well as the name or series of bonds issued for that improvement area. We have specifically highlighted the 2 series of bonds that are associated with the improvement areas for the developments for the folks that are in the room today, so you can concentrate on those as we go through. We've also identified whether those bonds have been refunded since their original issuance, which is the case for those of you who are in improvement area 14A. We've listed the amount of principal that remains outstanding for that debt, the year that the bonds were initially issued. And the reason we've done that is to show you that in most cases, that debt was 30-year debt, just like your mortgage, and it does have an expiration date. So right next to the year issued is the date in which those bonds will mature and go away, and that special tax associated with that debt service will go away. We've also identified the next date in which we can call those bonds for economic savings, which in the case of both of the series of bonds that we're addressing today, we are looking at refunding. And just also generally for your knowledge, and I believe some of this has been touched on before, we are only addressing the refinancing of the principal and interest associated with that debt. So as we've gone through the program today, we've gone through a number of line items that the city is looking at in order to give you some savings. I am only addressing the principal and interest, and you can think about it very much as your mortgage. It's a very similar process to your going out and refinancing your mortgage in order to bring down the interest rate. The principal amount stays the same, and the amortization will occur in the same manner. There will be no extension of the final maturity of debt. What I want to point out specifically for these 2 series of bonds is that, as Mike alluded to earlier, both of these series of bonds were issued under what's called a pooled structure. And so the special tax revenues that are generated from multiple improvement areas were pooled together and are pledged for the repayment of one series of bonds. And so there is in the legal contractual documents separate what I'll call district bonds that are associated with each of those underlying improvement areas. So there is a way to allocate appropriately the amount of principal and interest that's associated with each individual improvement area, despite the fact that they were pooled together. All right, one more, please. Okay, so we're going to start with the first series of bonds, which is Series 2007A. This impacts improvement areas 3, 11, 14, and 14B. And what you see on the screen to the right is the amortization schedule of those existing bonds. And you will see that the final maturity is 2037. You will also note how much of the principal of the bonds matures in each year. And again, like your mortgage, some of that principal is amortizing every year and the principal is going down. And then you'll also see that there are coupons. That's the interest rate that bondholders are getting paid on each of those maturities. And the range today is anywhere between 4% to 4.625%. The market is better today than it was when we issued those bonds. It isn't significantly better, despite the fact that we are at near historic lows in the bond market, but it is, we believe, enough difference that we will be able to finance this and provide you with savings. And so that is what we're attempting to do. Again, as Mike alluded to earlier, we are looking at all possible options, whether we break the different improvement areas apart and sell them to different private placement banks, or we pool them together again, will depend on the interest rates that we receive back from our competitive process of bidding, efficiencies that we may be able to accomplish through the pooling, perhaps lowering the costs of some of the consultants that are working on the issuance, and just the efficiencies of working with one bank as opposed to having to do them separate. So we will be bidding it out both ways, and then we will be doing a comparative analysis to determine the most effective economics for each improvement area, and that's what we will go with. Okay, so now what I want to do is to go into each of the separate improvement areas quickly, so that if you know the improvement area you're in, you can see how this might benefit you directly. And so I'll start with improvement area 3. Of the total amount of bonds outstanding for these series of bonds, improvement area 3 has 3.42 million still outstanding. The final maturity of their stream of revenues and their debt is actually 2032, so a little shorter than the bonds, because one of the improvement areas actually has a longer term than this one does. The rate and method of apportionment, which is the contractual document that is used when the district was formed and when the improvement area was formed, has a clause in it that allows an escalator on the tax. However, in this particular instance, the debt that was sold on a level basis. So while the special tax could escalate and the difference between the tax and the debt service could be used for other things such as pay-go, which we'll talk about separately, your debt service itself is level. And so we would look to refinance it, keeping the debt service level. So that keeps your special tax, that component of it, level as well. So again, thinking about it as if it's your mortgage, we're going to be looking at a direct placement. We've gotten indications from banks at roughly 3.97%. So if you compare that to the 4% to 4.625 that they're currently outstanding at, you can see there's a lower interest rate component. We also expect to see some savings from the existing debt service reserve fund. Now, this is a different reserve fund than the one that Mike referred to earlier, which is a delinquency reserve that's been being levied for. This is a reserve fund that's established when the bonds are originally issued, and it's cash that came out of that sale of bonds that is left with the trustee, and it's there specifically to pay the principal and interest to the bondholders should there be delinquencies that are high enough that there weren't enough revenues there to pay the bondholders. So initially, that debt service reserve fund was funded at 100% of a specific formula, which is the reserve requirement. Because we're looking at doing this as a private placement, we should be able to reduce that to 50% of the requirement and potentially even lower depending on the bank. So there should be some real dollars there that will also help towards the savings overall. And then finally, there will be cost of issuance associated with any refinancing, again, just like your mortgage. In this case, a private placement is a little more efficient than doing a public offering. The costs of the consultants tend to be less. There are savings because we don't have to go out and pay for a rating on the bonds, and we don't have to prepare what's called a preliminary offering statement, which can also run in the tens of thousands of dollars. So by doing a direct placement, our hope is to also achieve some lower costs of issuance. Now, as far as timing, our hope is to be able to have the private placement refinancings done by the middle of July, closed and refinanced. We will then be able to provide the new debt service schedules to the folks at Webb, who will then be enrolling the levy for the next fiscal year. That will, once enrolled, affect your fiscal year 17-18 taxes, which are due on December 10th of 17 and April 10th of 18. So that is the hope. And then on the next slide, this is just a graphic presentation to show you what the average annual per parcel savings would be. There are 513 parcels within improvement area 3, and because the differential in the interest rate is not a huge amount, the dollars may seem low, but again, our hope is that we can improve upon this once we get the actual bids from the bank, and that we can provide as much savings as possible. Our expectation is, and I believe the graph on the right, that right column should be shifted down one cell. The gross savings is expected to be about $256,000, and the average annual savings for the 513 parcels is approximately $33 a year. Now, it doesn't sound like much, but again, our hope is to try and get that to be higher, and to get you any savings between this refinancing and the other components that we're looking at that we possibly. Next slide. The next improvement area impacted by the 2007A bonds is improvement area 14. The par amount outstanding in this improvement area is just slightly over $9 million. The final maturity of bonds is 2032. In this case, the rate and method did not allow for any escalator of the special tax. There are over 1,900 parcels in this district. The refinancing assumptions for this improvement area are the same as in improvement area 3, so I won't go into those in detail. Timing is also going to be the same. And so, as far as savings expectations for improvement area 14, gross savings is expected to be over $700,000, and that would be over the remaining life of the bonds, which for 1,908 parcels ends up being about $25 average annual savings per parcel. One thing I do want to point out to folks is that rate and method of apportionment that I've referred to a couple of times that is distinct for each improvement area, it has a graph in it that actually reflects the special tax that each parcel is paying, and typically it's based on the size of the home. So these are all average numbers. Your particular home may be slightly higher or slightly lower, depending on where you fall in that formula in the rating method. So this is an average. Okay, and finally for the Series 2007A bonds, improvement area 14B has just slightly over $4 million remaining outstanding. The final maturity of this improvement area is 2037. It also does not have an escalator in the tax. There are 311 parcels in this district. Next slide. Gross savings in improvement area 14B is anticipated to be about $435,000 over the life of the debt, and the average annual savings per parcel is expected to be at $70. All right, similarly to 2007C, we also have the 2007A, we have the 2007C local agency revenue bonds. This was also a pooled financing. There are 4 underlying improvement areas within this. The only one, I believe, that's impacted by folks in the room today is 14A, so we won't go through that. Again, you'll see the amortization and the coupons for the original bonds that are outstanding. Here, the coupons range from between 4.25% and 5%. Next slide, please. And so for improvement area 14A, they have about 15.7 million of bonds still outstanding. The final maturity of these bonds is 2033. There is no special tax escalator for this improvement area, and it covers 1,255 separate homes. Again, the refinancing assumptions are all the same, and the timing is expected to be the same as well. Gross savings in this district is anticipated to be over 1.3 million over the life of the debt, with average annual savings per parcel of $66 for 1,255 parcels in the area. And with that, I will turn it back over to Rich.
Thank you, Katie and Mike. So we have covered quite a bit of information here today, ranging from CFD 101, the refundings, talking about reduction in pay-go. So what we're going to do now is actually illustrate what does that mean to each of the property owners as we proceed through here. So, but just out of curiosity, by show of hands, are you aware which improvement areas you're in? Do you know improvement area 3 by chance? Did you raise your hand? Not too many. How about 14? And then 14A, which would probably be me, and then 14B. So it's like majority 14A. Okay. So what I'll do is I'll focus just the next slide here on this presentation shows each of the improvement areas, and what I'll do is I'll just run through 14A as majority from 14A. First and foremost, I just want to point out this is an example only. So what we did is we applied this savings we're looking at to last year's 16-17 enrollment to show you if we had this done now, what would it have done for you last year. We're in the process of calculating 17-18, so there'll be some variations to this, but what we just want to show is an illustration. So this table essentially shows the budget we talked about, that second group of column or rows, has the very familiar terms. You'll see the debt service, administrative expense, reserve, and then the future facilities. And so on this slide, what we're showing you is if we cut that future facilities by 50%, what would that mean for each of the property owners? And so you would see a range for 14A, we would cut about $54,000 out of the special tax requirement, or it would apply another $43 of annual savings to your actual property tax bill. And so at this point, I do want to point out, and many of you may be aware of this, if the two 14 and 14A, that would be your combined savings. And then the same for 14B, you would want to combine what's listed for 14 and 14B, because you have an overlap, you're in both of the improvement area. And that would be the same for the refunding information that Katie had covered. And so with anything there's fine print, we just want to point out that these are averages, right? So different homes have different rates. So what we show here is an average. It can be more or less, obviously, between your actual property for each improvement area. On the next slide, kind of brings everything home. It shows that we cut the reduction in the future facilities by 50%. If we did the refunding, what does that mean for you at the end of the day? These are not huge numbers. We're not able to give you drastic percent decreases, but what we are able to bring is some reduction in what you've been used to in the past. And so, again, I'll just focus on 14A. If we said we're going to cut $54,000 out of the pay-go, we're going to give you about $72,000 on an annual debt service reduction. We're going to reduce the average per parcel by $101, or about 8% from what you're historically been enrolled. So the summation of this is essentially bringing everything together. Same deal. I mean, there's footnotes on here to just say these are averages per parcel, but again, this is just this total summary of what is expected and what we can do as far as the reduction for your property taxes. The next slides we're going to go into here is just a list of authorized facilities. And so we talked about having some funds on hand, and there's the ability for the city, once your feedback is, what would you like done with those funds? And so there's a limitation on what those funds can be used for. It's not all encompassing. So we're limited to what was approved at the formation. So there's a resolution of formation document that spells out what exactly the authorized facilities are for each of the improvement areas. A lot of it overlaps. You'll see the same thing in each one. But I'll just run through them very quickly. As an example, when we've heard at the last meeting, the Oak Valley interchange or off-ramp was something that the property owners would like to have improved. So under the transportation systems item, that would be something that could be done. That's your roadways, your bridges, your off-ramps, streets, curb gutters, street lights, things of that nature. So just to give you an example, this is how you could apply those funds to that. But in general, in improvement area 3, for example, had funds that were authorized for the sewer treatment plant and transmission systems, domestic and reclaimed water, transportation systems, flood and storm drains, parks and open space, and then public safety facilities such as police stations and fire stations. The next slide has the list for improvement area 14. Very similar list. In fact, it's the same list with the addition of school facilities. So in this particular improvement area, there was the ability to fund elementary and secondary school sites if that was the choice at the time. And then the last one is the improvement area number 18, where we have a little bit of smaller list. The difference here would be the removal of the school, removal of the parks, and then instead of saying a public safety facilities, it's calling out specifically the West Side Fire Station. And so with that, that concludes the presentation of what we're able to present to here. I'll turn it back over to the city manager for some closing statements and his directions, and then we'll open up for questions in there. Todd.
Josh, any questions?
We just overwhelmed you with all kinds of
Number
information.
suit, isn't it? But again, I think as we saw, what we're trying to do is to work through where we can. Where are those opportunities? And I wish I could stand in front of you and say, hey, guess what? We pulled the rabbit out of the hat, we got rid of most of it on some of the big ones, but there's not a rabbit there. So we're trying to, to whack them all. We're trying to whack them all as it's popping up, I think. So what I'd like to do at this point is really kind of try to field y'all's questions. So we've got our panel here, so we'll try to address any and all questions that y'all may have. So I'll probably troll out here and kind of help bring the questions up since we don't have a microphone out here. So y'all ready? So if you'll just raise your hand for me. The key thing too is, I know we're on a time frame and the school's gonna boot us out of here at 12:30. So we have about an hour and 13 minutes, that's good. If we can't get to your question, or even if we do, I would just encourage you on your comment cards, if you'll write that down on your card, we'll collect those from you as you leave. And I am creating a list of all the questions that we receive in every one of these meetings, and those are going out to council. They're also going out to our staff consultancy, so we can try to track down information that's there. So again, I encourage you to do that. So one last piece on the 93-1 CFD. The way that Beaumont's structured, it's a little unique in that we created a single CFD that covers all the newly developed or newly developing areas within our community. Old Town, original town that was already there was not part of that 93-1. So when we talk about IAs, your improvement areas, that's a sub-area of the large CFD district, okay? And so how it was structured is there's an assessment that comes in, and we talked about the mandatory things that we have to pay, and then you've got the pay-go part of it. And then the pay-go dollars that come in are then eligible for application throughout all of that 93-1. So that's how it's there. I know we've had a lot of comments about, so you're taking my money from my neighborhood and you're spending it way across town. How is that legal? The way that CFD was structured, that was legal, okay? I think the problem was we didn't track that an accounting basis wise and a financial basis wise to be able to show you where every dollar went and why. And so those are the things that Rich and his firm are really helping us drill down and say, hey, what are the best ways to be able to track those and to report those back? So I can't tell you right now what your money went to back in 2005, all the way back to 1993. But we have tracks that we know what dollars were there, and we know, and we reconciled what came in, and we reallocated those to make sure those are addressed. So I think those are important. So yeah, let me come on over. Yeah. Okay. Sir,
Ready?
we're ready.
Good morning, I'm Greg, I'm from the Stetson area. Quite a presentation this morning, a lot of numbers, a lot of talk, it was interesting. My dad lives on bond money and I take care of his financing. I think how it all ties in, he gets his money and it's municipalities.
Give it a
So
Come down here.
here's my question. I'm in District 18, and I saw in the paper it said it was fully funded, and I'm just saying to myself, do you think I'll receive any kind of relief because I went and paid mine off? Even though I paid my assessment off early, I still pay like $400 a year. And I'm just wondering, I wonder what those costs are. Is it a maintenance fee, or what type of collection is? Here's the bottom line, is, in good faith, I paid mine off early. Do you think once this is all said and done, am I gonna receive any other type of relief, or is that just water under the bridge?
So, to address your question, so as we mentioned in the presentation, there's two taxes, right? There's a facilities tax and then there's a services tax. What you're able to prepay, and what you prepaid was the facilities portion. So that went away with the bonds and you paid your share off and it was all done. You don't see that any longer. What remains is the services portion. That cannot be paid off. That will have to remain as long as the agency provides the service. And so I believe off the top of my head for your improvements, about $320 per year you pay for services.
And it escalates every year.
It does. So that the services portion in the majority of 193-1 escalates annually by what's called the CPI. So every time the consumer price index adjusts each year, we adjust that tax rate by that amount.
So, like I say, does District 18 look like it's in pretty good shape as far as solvency with the bonds?
Right, so all of the bonds are solvent. The city's never missed a debt service payment ever, so it's not a concern that should be able to meet the needs for that. Okay.
Well, we hear a lot about 14A, 14C, but
Sure.
hey, look at 18, isn't 18
Sure.
looks like they're in good shape?
Yeah, so just to answer that specifically, those bonds were already refunded once for savings. I don't know if that happened before or after you prepaid, so it may not affect you. There's just slightly under $5 million that's still outstanding. The final maturity is in 2034. Low delinquency rates. We don't anticipate that there's any problem with those bonds outstanding now. They aren't optionable for refunding again until 2025, just because they were recently refunded and they do have a 10-year par call on them. But they seem to be doing fine. I don't have the information here on whether or not they have an escalator or not, but you wouldn't care because you've already paid them off.
That's what I mean, being I've prepaid, it doesn't affect me at all whether
It
I
does
go up or
not.
down.
No, you're done with
I'm
that
done,
portion.
I'm done, all
You're
right.
done.
I appreciate
Thank you for the question.
All right, thanks.
And I'll say one thing, because I know there's a couple from Stetson here this morning, but there was some discussion, I think, in the past about some park improvements that were in the plan that actually didn't get developed.
It didn't happen.
Well, and I'll tell you that I think there was a misunderstanding there because your CFDs in that particular IA don't provide funding for park improvements. So something we have to look at, but we can't use CFD PAYGO dollars. We have to look at impact fees, we have to look at other sources of funds to do that. So I know that has been a key issue in Stetson and 18 for quite a while. So it's something we're going to go back and look at what can happen. I think what we talked about is that it's underneath the Cal Edison power line or within a Cal Edison easement, and there was a concern about whether we could do that within Cal Edison. It's not uncommon to put and locate certain types of rec facilities in those easements, so we'll go back and look at that. So we haven't given up hope, but in terms of CFD and PAYGO, your dollars aren't going to that, but there's other ways we can try to look at that. So, any other questions?
I'm not quite understanding the, you said there are two parts to the CFD. There's a service part, and then there's something that covers services, and then the other one covers whatever. And the gentleman that just spoke, he paid off the part that doesn't cover the services. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, and from what I was hearing, you have not arrived at a way of determining what that amount would be if I, as a homeowner, wanted to pay off my portion of the CFD. Is that correct?
Well, the process doesn't work where we can predetermine what your payoff amount is. There's an assessment process, an evaluation process that Webb and Associates, as our special consultants, have to go through to calculate that for you. So it can be calculated, but it's not like your mortgage, or it's not like your credit card or things where you can say, hey, I'm paying down my balance, what is that? Because it's structured differently, it's not like a lien. So we have to go through a process to be able to calculate that and to help you determine what that payoff amount would be.
Right, I understand that, but I thought there was, I don't know, August or September or whatever, there is a date that if I wanted to pay that off, as of that particular date, I would be notified, or I could call up and find out what that date is. And at that point, you would be able to tell me what the dollar amount is for me to pay off the full amount of my principal, as I understand it, of the CFD.
We are going to go to council in June to have council now accept a policy. We froze taking the special assessment or the prepayments on those assessments because we need to reconcile the books and we need to figure all that out. So what we're in the process right now of doing is calculating what your assessment rates would be and going through that process, which is what we need to do to tell you what your calculated payoff amount. So in August, if you call up and say, hey, I want to know what my payoff amount is, then we can work with you to start that process. Now, there's costs associated with running that calculation. We don't know what those are going to be yet. We're working through that to look at what that may be and how to work through that process. But you won't be able to call up on August 1st and say, I want to know what my amount is. There's a process that they have to go through to run that calculation for you.
I understand.
But you'll be able to call in and to be able to request and start that process starting in August.
And there is a fee involved with that if I make the request.
There will be a fee.
Okay. How much is the fee?
We don't know. We're looking at trying to calculate that at this point. And we're not, I can't tell you right now. We're looking at that.
And in the process of redoing these bonds, putting them out and getting bids on hopefully lower interest rates, the end date of the program or the bond is unchanged. So if this bond had an end date, finish date of 2030, let's say, that end date has not changed. It's not going to change.
That's correct.
Okay, and likewise, the principal does not change. So that whatever it is as of 2020, if we look at that date, that principal will not change, even if the bond is renegotiated.
Yeah.
The par amount proposed of the principal may in fact change. It will likely go down because of the efficiencies of the potentially having some revenues that we can contribute to downsize the bond transaction, potentially lower reserve fund, as I mentioned before, to fund, because we'll be taking those reserves that we have on hand now and applying them, and only having to fund a smaller proportionate share. So you may see the principal amount change, but it will likely go down.
Okay.
And the next final question I hope that I have is, if I do choose to pay off my portion, and then somewhere down, a few years down the line, I sell my house, that house will then be sold without the Mello-Roos, without the CFD. Okay, great.
That's very good. I think one other thing too is we're looking to make these new issuances callable also, so that at some point we can refinance them again. And one of the things that Mr. Bush was talking about was a policy, a best management practices policy, that we evaluate these and where there's opportunities in the future to do again and make some savings. We want to keep looking at that. So this isn't a one-time, but we can't recall these and refund these every year. We have to wait a period of time to make that happen. So, anything you wanted to add?
No.
I just have a question. Why are services paid with CFD dollars versus the general fund?
So it is not uncommon for public agencies to rely on as many sources as they can to provide those services. As the city manager mentioned, there's limited funds that come from the county property taxes to the tune of about 8 cents per dollar that's collected. And so as a means, what agencies will do is fund those and the additional impacts to the city through the CFD. So it's in a sense it's putting the kind of the onus onto some of the new developments to cover their share. And the CFD is used to do that.
Okay, what services are we talking about that through the CFDs? Is that?
So it would cover things such as the landscaping of the publicly owned parkways and medians, in parks, open space, street maintenance, street lights, traffic signals, street sweeping, drainage facilities. So there's a curb in the catch basin that catches the water. Those have service requirements. So the funds can be used for that type of maintenance.
So we're not talking city employees. I'm talking, police, fire, stuff like that. That's paid through general fund. It's just,
Right, so much like the facilities list that I mentioned before, it's a very specific use for the funds. There's a very specific use that the Mello-Roos Act allows for services and that was approved for. Now, I will say that newer CFDs are, in fact, there's a third tax that are paying for police and fire and ambulance and paramedic services. Your CFD is not, so it's not included. They're prohibited from using funds for that service.
Richard, if I can add a couple of things. I think a couple of things important to think about on the property tax side, because if you think, okay, you've annexed me in, I've improved my property, and there's associated taxes that should help cover that through your standard, your base tax bill. But keep in mind, we're talking 8.4 cents out of the dollar, and then for that portion that has been annexed in, 75% of that 8.5 cents is actually going to the county. So what the city sees out of that sales tax, or I'm sorry, out of that property tax portion is very, very small. And so that's where the services CFD assessments come into play on that. If you look across the city, when you look at all the services dollars that come in, CFD dollars, it represents about $3 million of what's collected for services. If you look at just the general fund alone, our general fund is about $31 million to operate, closer to $32 million for next year. So it's a small portion of what's needed to operate. If you look at the revenue stream for the general fund in total, property taxes alone, just that portion of that 8.4 cents that comes in represents about 3.5 million of property tax. So between the CFD and the property tax, that's 6.5 million out of 32. Yes, sir.
I'm looking at this chart here, and you have CFDs that appear to have been created in 2015 for some of these areas. And I would be interested to know what they were in 2015, like like looking over 18 and 16 areas, what would prevent from new CFDs being just created with, I guess, under Prop 218, you have to have a vote for a new CFD, correct?
Those weren't new CFDs, so new CFDs haven't been created, there was some refinancing.
That's what that is, refinancing?
That's refinancing, yes, sir. So if you remember back, there was about 350 million or so that we showed in bond funding. About 110 million of that was for refinancing. Some of those you see in 2015 were part of that refi.
So you have, now those have dates, so those dates were 20, like 19 years before. Those CFDs were created in 2015 with the maturity date of 2034. The ones that were created in 2015, what was the prior maturity date, still the same? I'm just looking at how you guys do the financing on this thing. If you look at this thing, it's 215, maturity date 2034. You say it's a refinance of the previous CFD. What was the maturity date of the original CFD?
So if you're looking at the chart, and I'll go specifically to the three at the bottom, 2015 B, C, and D. That was the series of bonds that were issued. They were issued in 2015, but those were all refundings, and you can see next to them the 2004D, 2004A, 2004B. They were originally issued in 2004. They probably had a 10-year par call, which basically locked them out for refunding for 10 years. In 2015, they came in and they refunded them. You can see the final maturities are 35 and 34, which is consistent with the 2004 initial date. That's
So it's the same date as the initial.
Yeah,
So
30 years.
basically, it's the same, the balance as far as
Exactly.
the principle's the same. You did a
Yes.
refinance.
Just like your mortgage, if you had issued
Yeah, I get it.
30-year debt and 10 years.
That's why
later
the
you came
number's
back-
lower. The number's lower on that because the deeper you paid it down.
Exactly. That's correct.
Okay, who went up first?
Earlier, we were talking about in the tax, that some of that money goes directly to the county. Is there a way to, one, renegotiate that so less money goes to the county from those funds that are going there? Or can we take and get them to take and refund some of that by additional services over and above, you know, what we're already paying in our general taxes for the county to operate within the city of Beaumont?
Well, that's a good question. I can get you your contact information for your supervisor if you'd like. I don't know if I can answer that anymore.
So the agreement Todd is referring to is referred to as the county master annexation agreement. It was with Riverside County and all the municipalities within the county. It's an agreement, ironically, from 1979. So it was the county's way to protect themselves from Prop 13 losses. And so what their money supposedly go towards is more regional service, like mental health and things of that nature. So as land was annexed in by municipalities, they wanted to ensure some level of funding to continue regional services. It's an interesting question to ask because it's been asked before whether or not that agreement is still a good agreement, given that the impact that it's had. One other area where I do think, however, you may be able to get some relief on the municipal side for more revenue, but it may affect the residents, is I think the county is too slow with property tax adjustments. The Prop 8 specifically, I think they take too long to understand the real value of property, both up and down. I think candidly, if you looked across the county, they had so much of Prop 8 reductions that I think there's a lagging tax base behind it. That if you were to audit the value, assessed value of each home, I think the tax would be higher. Unfortunately, it would mean your tax bill would go up. But I think the cities, municipalities lag behind on property tax because of it. And so they're forced to make changes, you know, service delivery changes based on the lagging revenue.
I have a question. Go ahead.
One of the clear public safety needs, particularly for 14, 14A, and 18 people on the west side, is obviously a new fire station. When we are renegotiating the bonds, is it possible to renegotiate the uses so that we can include public safety as part of our
what we're paying taxes for in the future.
A lot of the IAs, the revenues coming in, do allow us to apply dollars to civic facilities, which include police and fire stations. So we've also got impact fee program that we've been collecting for the construction of the West Side Fire Station out there in your area. I don't know if y'all are aware, but we're looking at the second phase of the Ventura project. So we're actually looking at an extension of Ventura down to 60 and creating the first phase of the interchange there. And we've been actually talking with the landowners. We actually have an MOU that was approved by council at their last meeting this week, which basically specifies that there's about, probably close to about 5 acres of their development there off Peturo. It's right across from where the Heartland project is out there, for police and fire station siting for property that's there. But we right now have about 2.9 million in collected impact fees for the construction of the West Side Fire Station. We estimate 4 to 5 million to design and build. So we're probably another couple of years out from having the funds that are there to build the facility, which would kind of coordinate with the timing for the roadway improvements out there as well. The issue, though, is going to be operating that fire station. And so it costs about $2.5 million to operate a standard fire station with a standard engine company. We've been talking to CAL FIRE about a way to do that. They've got a strategy on how to do that that would reduce that annual operating cost about $1.1 million in today's dollars. So part of the fee assessment that Michael alluded to that's been implemented to some of the new CFDs, it includes a public safety assessment that will go to help fund the operations of that. That's going to be the challenge for us, is actually staffing and manning the ongoing operation of the station.
But I'm commenting on refinance, on when we refinanced the current CFDs from 14 to 14A, for example. Can we change the use to allow some of that money to go for the fire station, which would add to the revenue?
Yeah, that money is already spent. That all the money that was issued when those bonds were originally issued has already been spent on other
Paying it
uses.
back.
Yeah.
Okay, I got it.
And in most cases, there's no authorization to issue any additional debt for any of these improvement areas either.
Should we add more to that? No, just kidding.
Earlier, you alluded to the fact that we got to look at that like a mortgage on our house. When we bought our property in 2003, we were told that we paid cash for the metal roofs, that it was $20,000. I failed to do that because, to be honest with you, I didn't think I'd be around. But now, I look at it, and I have paid almost $26,000 for this metal roof. And if we have to pay it off now, is it still going to be about 20, 26, 30, 35? Or will it be like our mortgage, and it went down maybe 20% or 30%?
Yeah, unfortunately, I can't tell you the exact amount, but if you, so there's two components, just like your mortgage, there's principal and there's interest. So I can probably have Webb talk specifically about how they calculate the prepayment amount, but it's going to be the principal that's still outstanding on your particular home, and then of course, you're not going to be paying that interest for the rest of the life of the bonds. So the amount should be lower now by prepaying than it would be if you just continue to pay on the regular amortization. Very much like if you prepaid your home today.
I got one other question. I didn't know anything about metal roofs when I bought the house.
Right. Oh,
As years back, on Proposition 13, the price of taxes just escalated in California. And the payers started a petition to reduce the taxes as such. What if we did the same thing in Beaumont? Because as I see it, Sun Lakes is running as good as we do, And they don't have no roofs. They have the golf course, it's a beautiful area, and, you know, Marge, that's my question, what would happen?
So, the city has covenant, right? The city sold bonds to investors throughout the country and California that are secured by your special taxes, right? And so those investors bought those bonds along the assurances that the special taxes would get paid timely in an amount sufficient to repay their investment in your bonds. And so any action by residents to repeal or reduce taxes below a level that was needed to pay debt service on the bonds, the city would be legally obligated to oppose such efforts in order to protect the investors in the bonds.
So in other words, they wouldn't do anything about it.
You can't legally, you've got obligations to investors to pay debt service on your bonds.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Excuse me, my name is Rosalind. I've been in Beaumont since 2004. I bought my home.
Can't
Speak
hear.
up, Dave. Can't hear you.
You're reminded.
Okay, my name is Rosalind. I've been in Beaumont since 2004. I live in, I think, 14, I'm not sure, but it's the Pulte homes off of Oak View, the estates. When I bought the home, first of all, I had a very crooked realtor. But he told me that, you know, there was mellow roofs. I didn't quite understand. I just didn't want homeowners association. But he said, oh, well, this will take care of your area around, and blah, blah, blah. And that was it. And then it would be $1,600. Okay, from that time up until about 2015, I saw that one figure on there, 16, 16, 16. And then we got the three things going on now, which I'm not quite sure I understand. It's 931-14, 931-1A14, and 93-1A14B. Those are all those that are on my tax. And the 14B says $1,091, and I don't know what that's for. And then the other one, the 14, for the city of Beaumont says $820, and then the other for the services says $288. Is that an accumulation of all that to say that's my revenues cost?
Yeah, so let me, yeah.
I can address that. And so you are correct. There had been a $1,600 flat charge on your tax bill since you moved in until about 2015. And when Webb came to the city and we were doing the administration, we found that in that particular improvement area, there was an overlap. And what the previous administration had been doing was levying it under one fund number. But you were always paying actually on the three. And so in your particular area, you are in, and everyone in 14A or B is also in 14. So we'll start off with 14 by itself. At some point in time after they formed 14, before they sold the house, they formed 14B and they layered it over. 14S on the tax bill is 14 services. Everybody in 14 pays the services. I think we've covered that pretty well. But so to answer your question, the three line item that showed up as a 15, 16 was the city's attempt for transparency to split those tax bills out separately, and then to show you the different debt that you're, or the different special tax that you have levied on your property. In some cases, the $1,600 that had been historically levied was not enough for property owners, so you saw an increase. In others, it was actually too much, so they had a decrease. And so that was the change, was truing that up and actually splitting those improvement areas out.
Okay, so I was wondering if the 1,600 was the total for all three, and these numbers are not adding up to that. That's why I was wondering.
Right. So the 1,600 is the maximum tax for your improvement area 14B. The 14 is actually based on the size of your home, so there's a rate times the square footage, and that will vary per home. And unfortunately, I don't know off the top of my head what yours is, but
24.
what?
24.
So, well, we're not limiting the assignment. I can tell you, I mean, whatever is on the bill is that rate times your square footage for 14.
Okay.
For your improvement area 14.
Okay. So, all right, so then the other questions I have in regards to what you guys have been talking about I just need to understand some terms, like, what does fully developed mean when you say fully developed area? What does that mean?
So-
Based on the surfaces that are required for the area, or what?
So that just means that the developer had intended to build 1,908 homes, and he has built all those homes. There's no other properties that are gonna be built in your area that would need to contribute to the special tax.
Okay, and how many bonds can one area have?
That would depend on the authorization amount, so it is not uncommon to where when a developer builds a CFD, that they do debt issuance as they progress through development. So you could have 1 or 2, or in some cases 3 issuances of bonds. What they're looking for is there's a maximum authorization that was set when that district was formed, and the total amount of debt that's issued cannot exceed that amount. But they can do it in several issuances up to that amount.
Well, that's what I was wondering, like, if we want improvements in the area, and if it's going above some set amount, we can't do it.
That is correct. And in fact, in the preliminary 14s, they've coveted at the last issuance, if there's no more debt that can be issued on those
That's what I
properties.
wanted to know,
Right.
because since I've been there, I saw, Rite Aid, all this stuff come up, and then they stopped this one big clump of dirt sitting on Old View where it was supposed to be a bunch of dirt. I mean, it was just a bunch of dirt. And then when the windstorm came, it just covered everybody's house, and called the city, and they said, talk to the developer. And I'm like, okay, so we back and forth. So I had to have my house sprayed down because it changed a whole different color. But, but the idea was that I was trying to figure out what were we paying for, which now you're telling me I see. And then that one improvement of the road, which I don't know what that was, because I didn't see any difference in that either. But I just wanted to understand that the other thing I had a question for was, where is it? Disclosure. Okay, well, if I wanted to sell my house, and I don't think none of us here are educated like you guys as far as knowing all of this kind of stuff. So it's like, how do you tell a person about this? Because I wasn't told this. I was just told one thing, some Melrose. But when we look at all this, it's because of the way it was so disorganized, you couldn't really explain it, right? How would you explain it now if I wanted to sell my house to somebody?
So that's kind of outside my area, apologies about it.
So, California law requires disclosure. There's a real estate form that you sign and you have to acknowledge when you buy a house, whether or not there's Melrose taxes on the property. And that form should give you an estimate of what the taxes are.
Okay.
Secondly, and most importantly, and I would tell this to any buyer of any piece of property, in connection with the closing of your house, you always get a preliminary title report. And that title report will show everything that's recorded on your property.
Yeah.
And your property will show a notice of special tax thing, and it'll say Community Facilities District 93-1, improvement area 14, improvement area 14B. It'll have both items on your property, recorded on your title, and showing up on your title report. So any person who's buying or selling should get that disclosure. It's required by law, and then it will also show up on your title report.
Yeah, I agree with that, but what I'm saying is most people, because when I was buying them, you buy, you're happy to get a house, and you don't really read all that crap, and so it's like, that's the truth, you don't really read it all, and what I am doing is, I was working when I bought it, I'm retired now, so I see more, but so I'm sitting around looking at everything, but I see that there's an issue here. It's like I need to babysit the city. Not talking about you, but I need to babysit the city as well as I was fostering kids. And so it's like, that's the way I feel. And it's like, we trust you all to do what it is that needs to be done. Regardless of our inactivity to you, I'm going to trust that you're going to do it. I come and I listen. Even at the council meetings, you can sit and listen, but if you don't really have an in-depth understanding, you guys are talking between each other and we're saying, unless we actually have some information. So it's just kind of sad, because I'm like, okay, I want to see improvement. I want to see it. I like Beaumont, I came out here thinking this is a perfect place, and then this happens. So I feel, used, abused, distrust, all those things. Yeah, and I still want to stay here. I don't want to sell because I'm probably going to die here before anything, but it's just that I hope this change. I hope it does change, and I hope there is more accountability. And I hope we don't have to sit there and watchdog the city to the point of, gosh, you can't go to the bathroom unless we know it, kind of thing. So that's pretty much all.
Yes, sir.
Just following up, you mentioned the disclosure statement. When I got the disclosure statement in my closing documents, it said maximum Belarus tax, $1,600. Now, obviously, that's not true. It's gone well over that. Is that false information? What if anything can we do and to who?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, so the legal requirement is on the seller of the property to disclose that. And so if, I don't know if you're a builder, I'm not trying to pick on Pulte, I just heard that they were one of the developers out there. But if it was Pulte or sold you your home, and they disclosed inaccurately that it was $1,600 when in fact it was something higher, then that's something that, there's potential liability or exposure to Pulte on, and you should go back and talk to the builder about it for failure to properly disclose your tax. But that's, unfortunately, the city can't be a watchdog on every real estate transaction that's in the city, and it's not their business. They establish these CFDs, and state law is set up to require these disclosures by any of the home builders, but the city unfortunately can't sit there and look over the shoulder of every transaction.
Yeah, and one other thing I meant to ask you, the escalator, what does that mean?
So in certain instances, the escalator is that the property taxes will go up by up to 2% each year. And in many instances, and not in any of your improvement areas, but in many others throughout the city, bonds were sold with debt service that increased 2% each year.
Yeah,
so
that's what
in
I have.
that case, the city has to increase taxes by 2% each year, so they'll collect enough money to pay the investors back.
Yeah, but that was what I was concerned about, because I'm going to every meeting, but
Yeah.
the Tournament Hills and all those people, when they were saying that, then it concerned me, because I was like, I read about Mellow Rule saying there could be a discretion of the city to raise the thing up if we're having, some improvements or whatever. So that's what I was concerned about, if our area was gonna be under that, where we had to keep going up, because it'll tax you out of your house.
The only escalator you all have is in your services tax,
Okay.
which I was described, where it goes up by the consumer price index each year.
3%.
And the rationale for that is that, well, the cost of providing these maintenance services isn't the same as it was 10 years ago, and it's going to increase over time. So what's a fair and equitable sort of gauge of how to judge what it goes up? And most places it's some percentage of the consumer price index. So that's what it is.
That being the case, why are we seeing a decrease in the quality of the services? Because all down, the landscaping and everything around through there has practically died out, is not being maintained, and we're paying for it, and it's going up every year.
Well, and that's some of the input that we need to hear back. Things that are occurring in your neighborhood that you want to see addressed, that's important for us to know and to put back in. And I think part of what happened with some of the irrigation too was with the drought. We had to cut back on watering, also to a certain extent, so that was part of it.
But I thought are we not using reclaimed water?
Nope.
No.
Not, why do we have all these purple things?
They put in and never connected.
Well, the long-term plan, and you're right, she's right. The long-term plan is to ultimately take the reuse water out of the sewer plant and put it into those purple
But that
pipes.
doesn't keep them from pulling the weeds.
No, I understand. So we're going to note that, and that's something that we'll go back and look. And I assume that those, some of the things that we were going to hear about is, hey, we need to see a more regular, higher level of maintenance. One of the things that we're working on with the budget for next year is we're trying to expand our Parks and Rec services. We're trying to expand street maintenance. And so where we're structured right now is we have 17 employees in our Parks Department. Only two of those are designated for street and right-of-way maintenance. Well, 2 people for a city the size of Beaumont is inadequate. So next year, we are creating a actual street maintenance crew, which will begin looking at asphalt and those types of things. But that means, and we're also adding 2 more staff members to the parks crew. So we have more resources coming in next year to begin to step up and try to do more practical
I
maintenance.
can understand that, but in Solera, I think we pay for our own repairs for our streets and everything. The city doesn't pay for it.
Inside the community.
Yeah, so
We
you're,
pay for
yeah, because
our
you're private
own street
streets.
cleaning. So actually, we're paying for it twice.
That's the HOAs.
Wow.
Yeah, sorry, that's the HR maintenance. Now, a
Right.
big chunk of the street maintenance is coming from pass-through highway dollars that pass back to the city through gas tax and through some of those restricted kind of funds. So that maintenance and those costs are coming from gas tax coming back. So it's not really property tax that we're collecting that's going into it. Because remember, we're spending $32 million in the general fund in terms of local CFD assessment for services, and then property tax. You only have about $6.5 million of that's covered through our local generated property tax types. So we've got alternative revenue sources that come in there helping to offset that. And one reason why we're able to take this next step next year and will continue to grow on into the future years is that we've got the Senate Bill 1 gas tax that got passed, so there's some allocation that'll come from that. But that's not a small number. We're talking next year, that's $260,000 this year. Next year, it's $750,000 is what's projected, and it's $10 million over the next 10 years. So, you know, that's a huge, you know, maintenance cost.
Assuming we can all stay in the state.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's true.
That's a moonbeam.
Dropping a moonbeam, that's what I call it.
Moonbeam Brown.
Probably for the attorney, is there a statute of limitations, and how long is the statute to make any claims against the builder for false information?
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, I don't know the specific statute of limitations on that. And there clearly is a statute, and I don't know how long ago you bought it.
2 years.
I mean, there's also, you know, there's some parts of the statute of limitations about when you knew or when you should have known, and that would factor into it. So I'm sorry, I don't have a good
Oh,
answer
that's
for you
okay.
on that, but yeah.
Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I just have a definition question. What does it mean by you're eligible for both refunding, is that refinancing?
Yes.
Okay, and then the reduction in pay-go, that's separate, what is that savings?
So we were looking at two things. If the bonds were callable and the savings was sufficient, you could receive savings out of refinance of your bonds. And so Katie done a presentation on which improvements, which bonds were eligible. And so the second part, as far as the reduction in future facilities, that's one that the city is looking to exercise discretion and to reduce the amount they historically collected. So right now what we presented was a reduction of 50%. So if there was funds that had been collected, not all of them did have collected, but those that did, we were illustrating that if we cut it in half, what would that mean to you, your tax dollar savings? And so that was the two different savings options.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
I think they can hear me. You indicated that there was only one bond. It fell, for Beaumont, it fell under one umbrella, so to speak. Did I understand that correctly?
No, one district.
One district, okay.
One district, right.
Let's call it an umbrella. So it fell under that district, all called, what was it, 1620 or something?
93-1.
93-1. Is there any way that those of us that paid off the Mello-Roos way back when, that as the city grows, as the facilities have to be put in, amended, fixed, repaired, that they will be doing another called 93-2? And so then the property owners who paid off one might then be confronted with two coming down the pipe?
No, so we've got 93-1, that's that one CFD. To create a new CFD, really requires a vote.
Yeah, since when these CFDs were formed, there was no residents in the districts and improvement areas when they were formed. In order to form a new CFD where there's existing residents like you all who are registered to vote in your homes, it would require a 2/3 vote of all the registered voters within the boundaries of whatever that new district is. And so, yeah, I mean, if you all sat there and said, you know, we really want, I'm making this up, but we want to tax ourselves more because the city doesn't have a really good library system, and so we want to form a community facilities district to fund the establishment of a better public library and pay for the services there, and we're willing to tax ourselves on it citywide, you could, you know, propose to form a community facilities district, and with a 2/3 vote of all of the eligible residents, or all eligible voters, you could form that community facilities district. But the city would not be in a position at this point in time to just impose a community facilities district over residents.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I have one more question. When you guys were talking about the improvement areas, okay, so for 14, there's 14, 14A, 14B, and you talked about the savings per parcel. If I'm in 14 and I'm in all three, I'm just kind of lumped in, does that mean each one of those things I'll get a set that the $100 for this one, the $81 was all added up together will go to one of my parcel?
That is correct. So if you, let's just say you're at 14B, so you would benefit from the savings of 14, you do $23, and then you would have $81 coming from 14B, so you had $104 a year coming off of those two line items on your tax bill combined.
Oh, okay, that's what I was trying to.
But that's for an average house.
That is
That
correct.
does not mean specifically for your
you're
house.
No, but, yeah, no, but I'm thinking.
Remember that.
If you have a big house, it'll be bigger. If you have a small house, it'll be smaller.
Yeah.
Yeah, well,
So
I know
average.
most of the homes in Solera are like 2,000, the top.
2120.
2120, yeah. And then the houses where I am are up to 26 or 28, I can't remember. The lowest I think mine is the lowest.
So you might get more.
Yeah. That's what I wanted to know.
Small, 1672.
Yeah.
Thank you. One other question, 386, that's not part of the improvement bill like that, that's a service fee, right?
You're referring to the 14 service tax? Yes, that's the service.
That's just, so that doesn't count as part of our millage.
It does, but it's not really part of this
It's not
scope
of
of
the
this
bond.
conversation.
It's not the bond money.
Right.
And that can go up, correct?
Yes, that goes up by CPI every year.
Just as a,
But not much.
first off, thank you so much for everything you've done. I think you've done great, and I think you've done great, sir.
Yeah.
And most of you are all young enough to be our children.
Unfortunately.
I just want to say thank you and know that as an older generation, and a lot of people here are, we appreciate you looking out for us, and we hope you will continue doing that. And we do appreciate the work that you've done. This is far more than most of us have been here about 13 or 14 years, and we've gone through a lot in city government, and we truly appreciate everything that you've done. You've done a terrific job. Thank you.
We have 2 more meetings. You should come.
I have 2 more.
I have one more question, I don't know if I know how to phrase
But
this
you can
right or
still come.
not. But what is the differences in the percentages of, that I hear some are 8 cents per square foot is based on, and some are 34 cents per square foot based on the community? I mean, Solera pays a higher per square footage, I understand, than some of the outside.
You're absolutely correct. So in 14 by itself, and this is going to get confusing because they use both A and B in both
Yeah.
the scenarios. 14 by itself has 2 zones. So Zone A and then Zone B. So Zone B has 8 cents per square foot, Zone A has 34 cents per square foot. I know this was a topic that came up quite a bit in the past. When the CFD was formed, this was the process the developer took and the city agreed to based on the product mix, I think.
But they were, in the beginning, they were just considered single family before they changed it to the 55 and older communities. Why?
Right, and so.
Shouldn't we have had a lower because of the type of community?
So unfortunately, once the CFD is formed and homeowners start moving in and buying the homes, there's nothing that could change it, especially once bonds are issued and it's been discussed. The city's obligated to bring those taxes and pay that debt service.
So were these bonds issued before Pulte took over?
I'm sorry, we're not hearing the question.
Oh, were the bonds issued before Pulte actually bought the properties?
The question was, were the bonds issued before Pulte bought the property? No, they were issued afterwards, but there's a difference in timing between the rates are set and then when bonds are issued. And so we've talked about this before, and we can only speculate. We weren't here with the city when
No, I
these
understand.
done.
Just has been.
Yeah, I think at the time when we were going back and looking at documents, it was anticipated the improvement areas, Zone B, was going to have bigger homes. So there was more to tax at 8 cents, and there was less property, or I'm sorry, I might be saying that
Backwards because we're Zone A and we've got 34 cents.
Right, and it was going to be a different product mix. What they ultimately built, I believe we've gotten feedback from communities, probably the same homes, and so, but because the CFD was formed and that was agreed on, there's no going back and changing it without a vote, as Mr. Forbath mentioned. That's a procedural process that would have had to been undertaken and approved, that's not been done.
Thank you for your.
Thank you very much.
Any more questions? I think we still have 20 minutes.
Did you say something at the very beginning that you were looking at developing some services on Oak Valley Boulevard or working with, could you tell us what those might be?
Gold-plated curbs. Water fountains in the medians.
Okay.
All
Are you
sorts of good
serious?
stuff. No, we've got a multi-phase plan for Oak Valley. So the first thing that you'll be seeing is some signalization going up at Oak Valley and I-10. I'm sorry, the 10. The 10. And so the next phase, then we'll be looking at some ramp improvements, so where you come off on either side. And then ultimately, there would be the reconstruction of that actual overpass. So that's a very long-range window. So in the next 18 months, you'll see the signalization going in. Within the next 3 years or 4 years, you'll see the ramps be constructed. And then we're talking, that overpass is probably a $25 million overpass, so that'll take a while. And we'll pursue other funds and other assistance with that. And then on top of that, there's some additional pavement widening that we need to do. Because, if you come off of Oak Valley into town, we have that weird cutoff section where we're missing part of the lane. So, we'll be looking at expanding that and kind of restriping and getting all that done. And then as you're going back towards the west, down towards San Mateo, there's some right-of-way improving, widening that needs to happen from there to link in. So those are the various things that we're looking at. So all told, begin signalization, ramps within the next, 4 years or so. And then the other widening, again, that'll happen within that same time period. The longer term, will be that ultimate widening as we go back out, and then the actual bridge overpass.
Are you looking or negotiating with any businesses to try to bring more revenue into the city?
Yes.
What might they be? That would be wonderful.
Well, we're proud of Wolverine, because that's bringing hundreds of jobs. That's bringing a lot of investment into the community. And so we're also, in the budget coming up for next year, is actually funding a full-time economic development professional. So we'll actually have a full-time economic development person. And a city our size should have at least that.
Just no warehouses.
And that's what our market is. That's the logistics centers is really where we are. And
Except there's so many warehouses along the I-10 corridor that are sitting vacant.
Well,
I know they're part of REITs and stuff like that, but that keep getting built with investor money. But if they're sitting empty, what's the point?
well, and that, I think the issue of sitting empty, again, we've got Icon and we've got Wolverine, which are two brand new ones that are coming in. those facilities are really state of the art in terms of what's being constructed and what's in there. So the cost to operate is really low. They're very efficient, due to that.
But you have to have somebody in them. Well,
And it brings our values
The
down.
newer ones, that I see as I'm going down through Redlands and everything are empty and they're building more.
Well, we're gonna do it better.
I hope so.
But one of the things that we're looking at is a dialed-in economic development strategy. We don't have yet a formal strategic plan. And so we're in the early parts of that process. So, within the next 12 months, we should have, a good strategic plan also. The general plan update that we're working on includes an analysis of Beaumont, an economic analysis, and what that is going to look at is what is an appropriate type of economic mix for our community. So when you look at the highways, but one major advantage that our city has is we're at the wishbone. So you got the 10 and 60. That we're right there at the confluence of that, and so when you look on the west side of town, that's kind of an ideal spot for logistics and access. So it's very desirable as a location. Not saying that's the right use, or that's what we want, but there's going to be a huge market demand for that. So we need your input on general plan.
On that said, there was a point they were going to build a Victoria Kind center, like in Rancho or wherever it is. So Victoria Gardens. Victoria Gardens. So did they just throw that out? Because it was going to be where you're talking now, kind of over that area.
The developer group that owns that property now is looking at something. They're looking at an integrated mixed-use project. So, a mix of retail, service, residential. So there's a mixed-use project that is being developed that they're looking at right now. So, and that MOU that I mentioned earlier, that council approved, really identifies the types of uses that they're looking at for that area. So, so that's part of the Potrero project. And
a nice shopping center would be good so I haven't traveled so far. Or maybe even a gym.
But there's a gym over on that shopping center.
A small one.
Are you contemplating putting roundabouts at the Beaumont cutoff, Oak Valley, I should say, cutoff, and the Cherry Valley cutoff?
No.
For sure.
So, right.
Because I've been hearing they're going to put roundabouts in there.
We have 100% control over the design for Oak Valley, and I can tell you, no.
Okay, what about Cherry Valley?
Cherry Valley we are putting in about $2 million towards the preliminary design for Cherry Valley interchange. And one of the things that we told WRCOG as part of that process is we get a say in the design, and we are opposed to roundabouts. So
perfect.
we're saying no roundabouts.
Especially if Gateway goes in with the trucks and people. Have you seen an 18-wheeler on a roundabout?
No.
They need both lanes.
We talked about when
It's
it's
gonna be a
entertainment
mess.
venues, right?
Yeah.
I know, I'm done. Totally
Okay.
thinking
So definitely no roundabouts on those two.
no man.
I wrote down your name just in case I see one there.
Okay, that's spelled M-I-C-H.
I got it right here, Todd Parton.
Well, I guess it's time to go.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank y'all very much.
Thank you for your